theyeshiva.net.
Ladies and gentlemen, the best kind of introduction for Rabbi YY Jacobson is as brief as possible. He's legendary. Everywhere you go, he's teaching Torah. Everybody just takes his Torah and keeps it to himself or herself and gives it over. And the busyness of all the problems that people have, it's also on his plate. The truth is, after getting to know him a little bit, I don't know how he does it. The Rav knows no night. B'chavod Rav, Harav YY Jacobson.
Thank you so much, my dear friend Rabbi Katz. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam shehakol niyeh b'dvareh. As I walked in here this evening, Rabbi Katz came over to me and he said, "Some people are worried for you." I said, "Why?" And he said, "Because last time, 2 years ago, you couldn't get into the house. You couldn't get into the Mandel house. And tonight, most of the crowd is watching online. And in quantity, there's relatively a smaller crowd here. So people are afraid, maybe you're going to be upset." I looked at him and I said 3 words: just one life. The truth is, I was here last year too, at Azi's and Rachel's home, and I was speaking mamish to myself. So just realize what an upgrade this is this year. I was looking at a camera. Azi did me a favor and he sat down for a few minutes. He even brought his dog to fill up the room a little bit. Rachel sat down for a few minutes. So this is an extraordinary upgrade by 9,000%. There was a Jew I knew. He was one of the great Rabbanim of Melbourne. His name was Reb Chaim HaKoyen Gutnick. He was a Telza, you remember him, a Telza Yeshiva Bacher? Came from England, after the war moved to Australia, and was a prominent rabbi there for many years until his passing. Rav Gutnick watched the rebuilding of the Australian Jewish community post the Holocaust, coupled with the renaissance of Jewish communities, of course, in Israel and the world over. And he once shared the following story. He would visit the United States once a year. Our winter time, their summer. One of the visits, he said, he visited the Lubavitcher Rebbe of blessed memory. This must be in the 50s or the 60s. And the Lubavitcher Rebbe asked him, what's the situation in Melbourne in terms of Taras HaMishpacha, family purity, the mitzvah of mikveh? So Rabbi Gutnick told the Lubavitcher Rebbe, it's not very popular. So the Rebbe said, may I suggest that you arrange a series of classes on the topic. You print nice flyers, you advertise it in the newspapers. You create a beautiful evening with some good food. You create an ambiance, an atmosphere, and you give 4, 5, 6, 8-week series. People come, women come, men come, families come, and they learn about the preciousness of this sacred mitzvah of mikveh. Rabbi Gutnick says, Lubavitcher Rebbe, the Melbourne community is not ready for this. He says, how do you know? If you don't try, how do you know? He says, I know the community. It's my landslide. I know the people. I know the lay of the land, as they say. Sadna Da'ara. They're not ready for this. This is not on the radar. There's certain things you can talk about, certain things you don't talk about. It was very hard for the Rebbe to back off from these types of things. So he urged him and he says, try, see what happens. Rabbi Gutnick said, he was pushing me to the wall, so I'm a gentleman. So Beles Breda, I had no choice. I said, okay, I'll do it. But in my heart, I knew it's not happening. I go back to Melbourne. I make the flyers. I advertise. I announce it at the pulpit. He had one of the biggest shuls. I bring food. I prepare it. Me and my wife, my Rebbetzin, we're working on it. We're looking forward to the first session. Lo and behold, one person shows up. One woman shows up. Now, anybody who's a speaker in this room knows the only thing that's worse than nobody showing up at an event is what? One person showing up. If nobody shows up, you can tell the Olam the next day the Prime Minister of Israel was here, the Defense Minister was here, the President of the United States was here, President of Russia was here. It works. The whole world was here. But if one person shows up, in Yiddish they call it Zabisha Nacharpa, you disappear. You disappear. The host disappears. One woman showed up. It's supposed to be a big lecture, a big class, a lot of food. There's no sushi in those days. In those days, the Japanese ate sushi. The Jews started to eat Chinese. The Jews were slowly becoming Chinese in the 50s and the 60s. But sushi was still in Japan. It took a couple of decades until we broadened our horizons. So, but whatever the display was, I can assume maybe there was cucumber and sponge cake. So, it makes sense. What was Shalosh Seudos in 1962 like, Rabbi Marty? Let's like Reuven Feinstein's Chavrusa. What was Shalosh Seudos in 1963 like? Anybody? And it's before my days. I know now it's jalapeno herring, but those days I think jalapeno also didn't belong to the Jewish people. It belonged to the world of botany. Okay. So this was supposed to be a big, nice maisep, they call it a respectable evening. One person showed up. Rabbi Gutnick was an orator. He was a speaker. He was a grand communicator. He knew how to give a drasha. He was extremely dramatic. He had a pulpit. You ever stood at a pulpit in front of one person? I mean, sometimes men try to do it to their spouses, right? They get up and they're giving the sermon to their teenage children. It's wonderful. So the same level of success you can have with one person. So he's standing at this one person. And he's telling himself, I knew it's going to flop, but she was there. She wanted to hear about the mitzvah. So what is he going to do, send her home? So he gave her, they did a chavrusa. Rabbi Gutnick with this Jewish Melbourneite woman, they had a chavrusa for an hour. He taught her the basics of family purity. His wife was there, he was there. The next week, one person showed up again, the same woman. And every single week, only one human being showed up. It was the same woman. The series finished. He made a bracha, Baruch Shepatrani, could be B'Shem HaMalchus, that I don't know. But he was certainly glad that this one is off his head. 1 year later, he put the story behind him. He visits America once again. And he pays his annual visit to the Lubavitcher Rebbe. He decides not to bring up the topic because he doesn't want to make the Rebbe feel uncomfortable and basically say, I told you, I told you. It's not the respectable thing to do. So he was quiet. During the conversation, he later related, the Lubavitcher Rebbe turned to him and said, by the way, did you ever implement what you told me you're going to do, the series about mikveh? He said, I have. Nu, wie is given, how was it? So he said, as I predicted, it was a colossal failure. In Yiddish, a kolossal. It was a colossal catastrophe. The Rebbe said, was geschehen? What happened? He says, I advertised. I announced it from the pulpit. I promoted it. I spread the word. One woman came for 8 weeks. One woman came from the whole Melbourne. One woman came. It was beyond embarrassing. And Rabbi Gutnick said at that moment, he saw that the Lubavitcher Rebbe's face grew serious. He looked him straight in the eyes And he said one sentence that would change his life. I'm going to say it in the original Yiddish, and then I'll translate it into English. Rabbi Gutnick's first name was Chaim, Reb Chaim. The Rebbe said, Reb Chaim, lass mir euch fragen etwas. Wie viel Mames hat Moshe Rabbeinu gehabt? Mehr wie ein Mame? Rabbi Gutnick, let me ask you a question. How many mothers did Moshe Rabbeinu have? Was it more than one mother? How will you ever know who that woman was? Or in other words, just one life. And then he realized some people just have a different perspective. For him, success meant the shul was packed. There were 400 women there, enjoying the display, catching up on the latest Australian news. And recently, Australia is pretty dramatic about its news. But this is a couple of decades ago. And then he gets up and he speaks to an olam. But he realized that from the perspective of a genuine Jewish leader, history doesn't unfold that way. Moshe Rabbeinu had one mother. He didn't have 400 mothers. He had one mother. One mother who brought him to the world. One mother who had the wisdom to place him in a casket and rely on God that things will work out as the little baby sister Miriam predicted. One mother who had the wisdom of playing along with Pharaoh's daughter, playing the game, making believe she doesn't understand, and nursing this strange baby, really allowing her the ability to nurture and protect her little baby, Moshe Rabbeinu. It was one woman who gave the world, the person who single-handedly changed history, created the Jewish nation, gave the Jewish people and the world the Torah, or as the Rambam calls it, Mifchar Mineh Nushi, the perfection of what a human being can achieve, like Kam Navi Bi Yisrael Kamoshe. It was one mother. It was one mother. How can you call a failure when you are talking to one Jewish woman and sharing with her a mitzvah that may change the entire family dynamic, the entire future of this family, and who knows, of the Jewish people, and who knows, of the world? Moshe only had one mother. We reminded each other earlier, one of the great Rosh Yeshivas of Torah Vadas, Rabbi Shlomo Hyman, of blessed memory, the famous snow of the early 1940s in New York. They still talk about that snow, before my days, but they still talk about that snow. He came to yeshiva, and two boys also showed up in yeshiva in Torah Vadas, but nobody else did. And he got up to give his shiur, to give his class, and he would give a long, fiery class, put his soul and heart and passion into it. And he's standing in front of two boys in this big beis medrash, in this big auditorium, and he's screaming and he's arguing and he's fighting his way through the Sugya and Rashi and Tosfos and the Rambam and the Rashba and the Ran and the Ramban and the Ritva and Rabbi Kivege and a shreit. And finally, one of the boys was half asleep. One of the boys was dreaming about the snowman. So finally, one of them gets up and says, Rebbe, was schreite? What are you giving this shiur with so much passion? There's barely two boys here. Nobody showed up. And he looked at them and he said, you think I'm giving the shiur only to you? I'm giving the shiur to your children and to your grandchildren and to your great-grandchildren and to your great-great-grandchildren till the end of time. I don't just see one person in front of me. I see, as you quoted before the Mishnah in Sanhedrin, one soul, a whole world. Never mind when it's not one life, 19,000 lives, 19,000 mothers. Similar to Moshe Rabbeinu, who had one mother, but 19,000 times. Who can estimate the value? Who can estimate the significance? Who can even understand the profundity, the depth of it? These are things that human imagination can't grasp, because who knows the secret, the mystery, the blessing, the meaning, the purpose, and the impact of one life? Who knows it? Only the one who knows it all, Ata Yedei Rosei Olam, knows it. You know, sometimes people come with different requests. I was having a conversation with a woman, and she says, Rabbi YY, I need the perfect husband. Can you help me find the perfect husband? I'm like, that's a tall order. But define to me the perfect husband. You know, one man's terrorist is another man's freedom fighter. The perfect husband for you may be for another woman, you know, a bandit, a despicable despot, lowlife. Give me some definitions and I can work with you. She says, for me, the perfect husband is somebody who wakes up every morning no later than 4:45 a.m., spends at least 2 hours a day in the gym, makes his own breakfast, makes his own bed, works hard and diligently, is responsible for his own lunch and his own dinner, and doesn't put it on his wife, does it all on his own. His room is tidy and clean, and he's responsible for it. He goes to the library every day to read a little bit, to enhance his brain. He's predictable. I always know where he is. There's no such a thing. He disappeared, his phone died, I can't get through to him. He's on a vacation with his friends. He also doesn't go on ski trips. He doesn't join the Kiddush club. No alcohol enters his system ever. And he's always in his bedroom, 8 o'clock at night, and he's asleep 9:15 p.m., no later. That's for me the perfect husband, Rabbi YY. Where can I find such a man? Can I find such a man, and where? I said, absolutely yes, in prison. We all love structure, especially in this neck of the woods. People like structure. People like discipline. Marty told me, be on time. The yekas can't deal when you're late. In the meantime, I was on time. You were late. But we won't go there at the moment. But the truth is, structure is cherished. But structure is only good if it's a foundation for transcendence. We don't worship structure. We use structure. When people start worshiping structure, then they're worshiping an idol, like many other idols. It's called the idol of structure. We don't worship anything. We worship a God who's undefined, who has no image, who has no structure. Structure is a tool, like every other blessed tool, to be able to touch infinity. An organization needs structure. An organization needs seder. An organization needs discipline. But more than everything, an organization needs a soul. There are people who are great at structure, but there's no soul. Everything is about structure. No passion, no life, no fire, no vitality. It's like you want to call the Chevra Kadisha. Okay, that joke is over. Only he got it. Okay. You know, the Maisa, the other day, there was a teenager. He had to go to a funeral. Nabach, it was his great uncle who died, 89 years old. The teenager had to go to the funeral. 17-year-old kid. He sits in the front row. The rabbi gets up at the grave to officiate. And the teenager looks at the rabbi and says, Rabbi, before you begin, I know this is going to be a long day and a long eulogy. Do me a favor, Rabbi, you're here all the time. What's the Wi-Fi code? Here in the cemetery, so I should be able to do something with my precious time during your long, boring, monotonous eulogy. The rabbi lost it. You know, sometimes rabbis could lose it. I don't know in this area, but sometimes rabbis can lose it. He lost it. He looks at this boy and he's like, respect for the dead! The boy looks at him calmly. He says, great, Rabbi, that's all in capital, I guess, right? Yeah. Talk about people, the rabbi was screaming, so it must be in capital. You know, it's not lowercase, it's higher case, it's emphatic. Talk about people coming from different worlds, different perspectives. There was a woman once, she came out of her mansion in Beverly Hills. So this homeless fellow comes over to her, ma'am, charity, you haven't eaten in 3 days. She looks at him and she says, wow, I envy you. I wish I would have had such willpower like you. Sometimes people just come from different worlds. They don't understand you. There's no empathy. There's no soul. There's no passion. It's completely two different wavelengths. And it's here where we see the blessing of just one life. But I want to introduce it through a very fascinating story in the Talmud and the Gemara that relates to this time of the year. It's Maseches Yuma Lamed Tes Amud Beis, Tractate Yuma 39. Talmud tells a story about the high priest, Shimon HaTzadik. He was a high priest during the first era of the Second Temple for 40 years. His tenure lasted 4 decades. He's mentioned in the beginning of Pirkei Avos, the ethics of the father, Shimon HaTzadik Haya Mishiorech Nesas HaGdoil. He was from the last remnants of the men of the Great Assembly, the 120 sages who created the renaissance of the Jewish people and the Jewish homeland after the second Aliyah, when they rebuilt the second temple, the second Beis HaMikdash. And the Talmud says, Shimon HaTzadik, Tana Rabbanon, the rabbis taught, there was a story about Shimon HaTzadik. One Yom Kippur, after he came out of the Holy of Holies, as he did for 40 years, he turned to his student and he said, I'm going to die this year. They said, Rebbe, how do you know? And he said, every year, when I walked into the Kodesh HaKadosh, into the Holy of Holies, on the holiest day of the year, there was somebody I encountered there. An old man dressed in white, bedecked in white, lavush levein. He would escort me out. But this year, I went into the Holy of Holies. And I also encountered somebody. But he was lavush chayrim. He was bedecked in black and dark clothes. He escorted me out. I knew I'm going to go. And the Talmud says after Sukkot, Shimon HaTzadik fell ill. The next week, he passed away. There was a little magazine, a monthly used to come out. It was called Hapardes. It was published by Reb Simcha Elberg, the head of Agudas HaRabbanim with Reb Moshe Feinstein. I once saw in that magazine Hapardes from 1944 the speech that Reb Yoshe Ber Soloveitchik, of blessed memory thereof, gave for the first or second Chag HaSmich of his students at Yeshivas Rabbeinu Yitzchak Elchanan during the Second World War. His father, Reb Moshe Soloveitchik, the son of Reb Chaim, passed away in 42, I believe. And Reb Yoshe Ber, Rabbi J.B. Soloveitchik, succeeded him. And this was the class that was ordained as rabbis in Yeshiva University in the early 40s. He quoted this story from the Gemara in his speech to the students. This was quoted in Hapardes, which I read years later. And he asked a question, what is the meaning of the story? He walked into the Holy of Holies on Yom Kippur and there was somebody covered in white and there was somebody covered in dark clothes. What's going on? The Pasuk says in Vayikra, V'chol Adam lo yiyesham. No Adam, no person was allowed to be there, even in the Heichel, even in the sanctuary on Yom Kippur. He was there alone. The Yerushalmi says even angels who are called Pnei Adam also were not there. What's the meaning? Shimon HaTzadik saw this fellow covered in white every Yom Kippur, and one year he was covered in a different color uniform, and therefore he knew he's going to die. What's the meaning behind this strange story? And Rabbi Soloveitchik presented the following interpretation. And he said Shimon HaTzadik was the person who encountered the beginning of the Hellenistic influence over the Jewish people. Remember the story, he himself met Alexander the Great, Alexander from Macedonia, Alexander Moigda, who was a disciple of Aristotle. His father Paul hired Aristotle to be the tutor of Alexander. And Alexander would conquer the world and he would introduce Greek culture, Greek philosophy to all of the regions, which would ultimately lead to the Syrian Greek Revolution, which would lead to the revolt of the Hashmonaim decades later. But Shimon HaTzadik already saw the beginning of the end. And he wondered each year, what's the future of the Jewish people? Until Yom Kippur, he went into the Holy of Holies. And when he went into the Holy of Holies, he saw an image. This wasn't a physical statue or a physical person or an angel. He saw an image of the Jewish people. bedecked in white. He saw the ancient, glorious, collective soul of Knesset Yisrael. And he saw that it was so bright. It was so luminescent. It was so filled with whiteness and positivity. He saw the purity, the pristine glory of his people. And he walked out from the Holy of Holies, renewed, invigorated, empowered. Yes, during the year he may have become pensive or maybe cynical or doubtful what the future holds. But on Yom Kippur, when he went into the Holy of Holies, not just geographically, when you go into the Kodesh HaKadoshim, to the deepest, quintessential space of the Jewish soul, and suddenly Shimon HaTzadik saw whiteness. He saw the purity of a Yiddish neshama. He went beyond politics, beyond corruption, beyond insecurity, even beyond trauma, beyond fear, beyond confusion. He saw the whiteness, and he knew that the future is bright. He says, this year, I walked into the Holy of Holies, and I looked at my people, but what I saw was darkness, not light. What I saw was bleakness, not positivity. And therefore I know that this is my last year. Why? Because a leader of the Jewish people has to always be able to see the bright future and potential of his or her nation. If I walk in to my classroom, to my home, to my school, to my shul, to my community, to my country, and all I can see is darkness, bleakness, negativity, I cannot serve as a Kohen Gadol. I can't serve as a high priest. I can't serve as a Rebbe. I can't serve as a manhig, as a leader. I can't serve as a father, as a mother, as a pedagogue, as a mentor, as a teacher, as a Rosh Yeshiva, as a mashpia, as a figurehead who can inspire the people. A leader must first and foremost be able to see the glorious potential intrinsic to every soul, the divine sacredness innate to every neshama. Doesn't mean the leader is naive and out for lunch. But when all somebody can say is, the good old days, you ever had in school somebody say, when your father was here, there was still mention in the world. But you and your bratty friends, you lost the plot. Not because the youth doesn't have challenges, but because in our world, you could only be one of two things. Either you're part of the solution or you're part of the problem. And when you're standing in front of your students and your children, you either see their weaknesses or you see their greatness. You either see their failures or you see their glory. You either see their mistakes or you see their potential. You either see their darkness or you see their light. Shimon HaTzadik says, I cannot be the Kohen Gadol anymore. I cannot be the high priest anymore. My tenure is up. I belong to a different milieu. I belong to a different generation. I have to graduate. It's time for me to bid farewell. It's time for me to pass the baton, to transfer the throne to another person. And Rabbi Yoshe Ber says to his students, he says, this is a dark time for the Jewish people. This was the middle of the Holocaust. Not just dark, the darkest black hole in human and Jewish history. But he says, but you are graduating as rabbis. If you look at the Jewish people and all you can see is blackness and bleakness and darkness and pessimism and negativity, and you will surrender to despair, you can't serve as spiritual leaders. Yes, it's a tough moment, but you have to look at our people and be able to see Netzach Yisrael, lo yishaker v'lo yinochem. You have to be able to see eternity. You have to be able to see glory. You have to be able to see holiness. You have to be able to see an eternal, extraordinary future from Sinai that leads straight to Mashiach. If you cannot see that whiteness in the Holy of Holies, you can serve as a leader. You can serve as a Rav. You can serve as a teacher. And I would add, you can't even be a successful parent in today's world. But you know, it doesn't only begin with the people. We, the people, doesn't even begin with your students and your children. It doesn't even begin with your friends' children and students. It first and foremost, as always, begins with yourself, with myself, how you view yourself. Only people who have compassion for themselves can have compassion for others. Only people who know how to recognize their own light within their own darkness can help see it, can help others see it in themselves. Or as David HaMelech says in Tehillim 27 that we say now twice daily for the next month and more, Achas sha'alti me'es Hashem, oisa avakesh. Shifti beveis Hashem kol yemei chai lachzos b'noyim Hashem alavaker beicholai. I ask one thing of God. This is what I beg, I plead for. I want to dwell in the house of Hashem all the days of my life, to gaze at the pleasantness of God and to visit His sanctuary. Everybody knows this is a quite intense, spiritual, refined, and deeply genuine prayer. I ask for one thing. Achas sha'alti. I ask for one thing. Oisa avakesh. If you were given one request, if you can ask for one thing, what do you ask for? And King David says, Shifti beveis Hashem kol yemei chaya. Wow. I just want to dwell in Hashem's home for the rest of my life. Lachzois. I want to see the noyam, the mesikus, the sweetness of the divine. I want to experience oneness with infinity. Open up a Medrash Tehillim where we look for commentary. And I quote, Omar Reb Abba b'Reb Kahana. Reb Abba, the son of Reb Kahana, said, Malchus Sha'al. King David was really asking for the throne. He was asking for kingship, for monarchy. And I look at the Medrash and I say, Riboinoi Shaloilam, Reb Abba, this is unfair. Where do you have an intimation of Malchus? He doesn't mention a word about a throne, about power, about winning the elections, about being the most powerful person of the free world, about controlling the Jewish people. He says, I ask one thing. I want to dwell in God's house all the days of my life and see His glory and visit His sanctuary. Where did Rebbe get this idea, Malchus Shal? The commentators are so perturbed by this commentary that they really search. They search for some explanation. And you know what they come up with? They come up with the following explanation. David said, Shifti beveis Hashem kol yemei chaya. I want to sit in God's house. Are you allowed to sit in the Beis HaMikdash? Who's allowed to sit in the Beis HaMikdash? The answer is, Ein yeshiva ba'azorah ela l'malchei Beis David. The only ones who are allowed to sit in the Azorah were the kings of David. So when David said, Shifti beveis Hashem, I want to sit. I want to have a seat in the Beis HaMikdash. I don't want to stand. Ooh, obviously he wants to be the king. Really? This is what David HaMelech was thinking about? One day when there'll be a Beis HaMikdash, which he never ended up building, everybody's going to be standing, right? But I want a seat. Well, in this case, all you guys are sitting and I'm standing. So I guess times have changed. But David was thinking, everybody, I want a seat. Okay. That's his great ambition of life. Give me a seat. I don't want to stand with everybody else. How are we supposed to understand this? Friends, I think Rabbi Abba is saying something extremely profound about life. And he's teaching you how a king thinks. How royalty thinks. How aristocracy imagines. Where was David? geographically and emotionally when he said this kapitel Tehillim. Look at the context. LeDavid Hashem oiri v'yishi mi ira. Who should I be afraid of? Shema Yischaim mi efchot. Why should I tremble? Oh, you already see that he's not in a comfortable place. And if you doubted it for a moment, there are people who are cannibals. They want to eat me alive. They want to eat my flesh. They will stumble. A whole platoon is descending upon me. I won't be petrified. They're staging a battle against me. This is not a kapitel Tehillim that is said while David HaMelech is lying on a hammock on a beautiful summer August evening in Bergenfield, New Jersey, rated the second to the safest city in the United States of America. I won't tell it to the people in charge on the taxes. Pay enough taxes, I'm sure. He was not on a hammock drinking pina colada, being offered this beautiful buffet of sushi by the great hosts, our Mandels, Azi and Rachel Mandel and their wonderful family. He was a fugitive. He was on the run. He has to hide me. I have enemies all over the place. Stop hiding from me. Al-Ticheni, don't abandon me. My mother and father already abandoned me. Vashem Yasfeni. And he finishes, Kaveil Hashem Chazak v'yametz libecha. This is a man who's on the run. This is a man who's surrounded by enemies. His own mother and father abandoned him. Finally, he marries, and his father-in-law, the king of Israel, Shaul, wants to murder him. Later, his own son, Avshalom, would stage a mutiny and almost kill his own father. They have expelled me from being in the inheritance of God. David HaMelech doesn't have one peaceful night. He ends up at the Plishtim who almost kill him. And he has to feign insanity just a few chapters later. LeDavid b'shanoisayas tamil ifnei Avimelech, and Avimelech, whose wife Nebuch had a mental illness, says, "Hachosem mishagoyim anoichi." My whole palace is filled with mishagoyim. I need another mishigana, and he throws David HaMelech out. That's how he saves his life, by feigning insanity. B'shanoisayas tamai. Now I ask you a question: when you're a fugitive, trauma after trauma after trauma after trauma, what do you ask for when you turn to God? What do you ask for? People suffering in such a state like King David. Before he was a king, he was a fugitive. He was a lone man. He was vulnerable and in absolute danger. He calls himself a worm. I'm not even a man, I'm a worm. Cherpas Adam of Zuyam. I'm the shanda of the people. I'm the scorn of the nation. What do you ask for when you pray? What do you ask for in such a state? Maybe to die a natural death in your bed. Maybe to have a roof over your head. Maybe a little bread to eat, a fresh garment to put on, a little water to quench your thirst. Maybe just to find a place where I could feel safe and secure and comfortable. That's what you ask for, right? That's what a fugitive asks for. I remember hearing once from Rabbi Lau Shlita, former chief rabbi of Israel, Rabbi Yisrael Meir Lau. You know, he said something, it was so obvious when you hear it, but it takes somebody to say it. He was describing his years in Buchenwald as a child. And he said as follows. He said, did you ever, Rabbi Lau's imagery, he said, did you ever watch an insect being hunted down, trying to save itself from you? In your bathroom, did you ever get annoyed with your mosquito? You have mosquitoes in this part of New Jersey? Or it's also the second most city with the least mosquitoes. That you have that bug, that roach, I don't want to say chas v'shalom, mouse or rat in your bathroom, in your pool, wherever it is. and it's crawling, and it fell it, and it's just trying to do anything to survive, and the focus is only survival. And it's operating on its most basic instinctive level. And Rabbi Lau says, that's who we were. We went back to our reptilian brain, and we were just operating on the most basic instinctive level. He says, I was like a hunted down insect, just looking for the next morsel of bread, the next morsel of food, the next drop of water, trying to protect myself. I remember once Professor Eliezer Wiesel, Zechrona Levracha, coming to my home. He and my father, my late father, were good friends. They were both journalists for many years. So they remained pretty close until the end of my father's life. He was the one person who eulogized my father at his funeral. So Elie Wiesel once came to my home. This was an official interview. My father, who was a journalist, he had a newspaper that he founded, the Allgemeine Journal, a Yiddish weekly. He would interview Professor Eli Wiesel. My father of blessed memory was a great interviewer because he knew very well how to listen. He could listen and listen and listen and then ask the right question at the right moment. And he was listening, and Wiesel was a storyteller. And at some point, I saw Elie Wiesel break down crying on the couch in our living room. And I've heard many speeches from Elie Wiesel. I never saw him cry before. It wasn't so easy to see a Holocaust survivor cry. For many of them, the wellspring of tears was closed. It was too intense. He was crying. What happened? My father asked him, what was the most humiliating moment in Auschwitz? And Elie Wiesel said, I'll tell you. I was walking with my father. They came from the city of Sighet in Hungary. It's the center of They were from Vishnitz, Hasidim of Vishnitz. I was walking with my father in Auschwitz. We were both emaciated. We were skeletons, Muslim. All I could think about is food. 14-year-old boy. We all know what we feel like Yom Kippur at the break, right? After Musaf. Especially with the help of our chazonim and our rabbonim, who make it more enjoyable. But you know that feeling, right? And now imagine the next night there's no food, and another day, and a third. We don't even imagine what it does to people. It just breaks you down. You're done. You lose your humanness. You lose your humanity. Thank God we don't understand what it means. We fast Yom Kippur, we kvetch for 12 hours, we say Al Chet, we hope that the food will be good, and coming fast, and sunset will be a little faster. Joshua held up the sun, and we try to rush the sun, and so be it. L'shana haba b'Yerushalayim, and we get to the drinks. But day after day after day, Elie Wiesel says, all I could think about is food. And finally, it was time for dinner. We call it dinner in Auschwitz. What they called soup, and what they called bread. And we both got our little portion. We devoured it within seconds. And I was schlepping there with my father. And Elie Wiesel said my father was still holding on to the food. I have consumed it. He still had his food. And at that moment, I had a wish. And the wish was that my father would die right there so I could take his food and have another little piece of bread and another little soup. And he looked at my father, he says, this is what the Germans did to us. That a 14-year-old boy, what's his dream in life? Was ist ein Chalem? What's his ambition? Everybody has ambitions, dream. What's a 14-year-old's dream? That his father should die. That was my most humiliating moment. But Rabbi Lau explained it to us once. He said, you'll never understand. We became insects. All we wanted was survival. Now come back to David HaMelech. You'll understand the depth of what Reb Abba is saying. When a person is surrounded by such calamities, when a person faces such adversity, such pain, what do you ask for? You ask for the bare minimum, You ask for a drop of water. You ask for a drink. You ask for a mattress. You ask for another day of life. What did David ask for? Achas sha'alti me'es Hashem. What did he ask for? Ask for a roof, ask for a bed, ask for food. No! Shifti beveis Hashem kol yemei chaya. Lachzos benoyam Hashem olavake beichalai. How do you explain that? So Reb Abba says, Malchus Shal, let me teach you how a king thinks. Because a king, a prince, even in captivity, even in darkness, even in exile, is still a prince. David never allowed the excruciatingly painful circumstances all around him to turn him into a small person. Malchus Shal, he always had his eyes on eternity. He never forgot who he was meant to become and what his soul was capable of. Even in these dark, trying conditions, what does he ask for? Intimacy with infinity. I want infinity to rule my life. I want to dwell in the presence of the Ribono Shel Olam for the rest of my life. All I want is intimacy with the divine. Who thinks about these things? Abraham Maslow's hierarchy puts them in a different order. And Maslow understood the human condition. As many Jewish thinkers, scholars, therapists, and sages. But David defies the imagination. Malchus Shal. Because he was always a king. The Gemara says about Shloimeh, his son. First he was a king over the world. He was a king over his country. And he was a king over his city. Then he was a king over his palace. And then he was a king only over his own family. And then he lost it all. Ulebesoif molach al makloi. At the end, he was a king over his stick, over his staff, over his skein. I ask you, did you ever try declaring victory over your stick? Maybe we should offer this to every candidate trying to run for mayor, governor, president. Just take a stick and become a king. Who's a king over a stick? Maybe I'm a king over my hat. Maybe I'm a king over my pen. If I would be a king over my smartphone, that would be a mess. Usually a slave to that. We don't have kings with technology. We're slaves. A king over the stick. So the Brisker Rav once said in yeshivish language, he said, Shlomo HaMelech is given be'etzem HaMelech. You don't understand. King Solomon was essentially a king. When there's people, it's expressed with people. If there's only a stick, it's expressed even with a stick. Nobility does not need the masses to display its true grand power. Of course, it's nice, Beroivam Hadras Melech, but that's an extracurricular activity. There's Malchus Be'etzem, Adoin Olam Hashem Malach, B'terem Kol Yitzur Nivra. Real Malchus comes before there was anybody to be there, before the audience. It's an inner attitude to life. It's an inner perspective. It's my inner Weltanschauung. It's what makes my heart beat. It's what the Kabbalists used to call an atzmi. Somebody who's in touch with his own atzmius, with your own essence. I'm a king. I'm a royal. I'm a monarch. I'm an aristocrat. If there's only a stick, it will be expressed with a stick. Where did Shlomo get this from? He got this from his father. Achas sha'alti. Malchus sha'al. It's a vision. So when Shimon HaTzadik comes out of the Holy of Holies, he says, if I'm looking at myself and all I can see is I'm petty, I'm traumatized, I'm in pain, I made so many mistakes, and this is what Jews do, especially this time of the year. If you're Jewish and you don't feel guilty, what do? You blame yourself. Or as somebody once said, when a Jew makes a fist, the next step is Ashamnu, Bagadnu, Gazalnu, Al Chet. The time of the year of introspection. I look at myself. I seem so messed up in so many ways. And even if nobody knows, at the bar mitzvah, I smile. At the buffets, I look perfect. At the wedding, I'm dressed to kill. I'm a great standing member in the community. But you and I and the therapist know what's really happening. And even the therapist doesn't know everything. Shimon HaTzadik says, you have to be able to walk out of Kodesh HaKadoshim and know that behind and beneath everything, there is light, there is positivity. You're a piece of God. You're a prince. Malchus Shal, you're a chelik elikami mal mamash, as the Balatanya says. You're a fragment of God. Now you can speak to your children. Now you can speak to your students. Now you can speak to other people. David HaMelech is simply the voice, Ne'im Zmiris Yisrael, articulating the deepest quest of every Jew. Achas sha'alti, you're really looking for oneness. You say, come on. I'm looking for this and I'm looking for that. As an extra activity, we'll also do Shifti Beveis Hashem. I'll go to Yarchikala for 7 hours. He says, you don't know yourself. You don't know your malchus. You know your pettiness. You know your addictions. You know your numbers. You know your distractions. You want to know yourself? You have to get to know your malchus. And then you'll see achas sha'alti. We're really looking for oneness. We're really looking for achas. You're looking for real intimacy with the divine, intimacy with infinity, which every relationship, especially a marriage, is a manifestation of. That ability to be able to see that, to be able to see that glory, to be able to see that potential. So you come to Israel, you're looking at one person who's experiencing a crisis in their pregnancy. It's very easy to just let it go. Plenty of headaches that plague Israel, that plague the people of Israel, that plague the Jewish people the world over. But that's only when you're not in touch with Achas Sha'alti. When you're in touch with the vision of Shimon HaTzadik, when you're in touch with the vision of David HaMelech, you look at this single woman and you know, Viful Mamas at Moshe Rabbeinu Gahat. This woman is carrying eternity. This woman is carrying a universe. This woman is carrying Klal Yisrael. This woman may be carrying a Moshe Rabbeinu. It's a different perspective. It's not just seeing what I see now from my superficial vantage point. It's seeing the full picture, seeing the future, it's seeing perspectives. Just 3 weeks ago, our family suffered a loss. My father's baby brother passed away. My father had 2 siblings. My father's name was Gershon Jacobson. He had a younger brother, B'Tzalel, and he had a baby brother, Shalom, who just passed 3 weeks ago at the age of 74 from complications connected to diabetes. And as I went to the funeral, to the Montefiore Cemetery in Queens to pay respects and bid farewell to my dear uncle, whom I was close with, a thought came into me when I remembered the story my father, my late father, shared with me once about his baby brother. My father was born in Mamontovka, near Moscow. This is in 1934, during the darkest years of Stalin's tyranny in the former Soviet Union. In 1938, during the Stalinistic horrific purges, my grandfather, whose name was Simon Yakubashvili, who's a Georgian Jew, our name is not Jacobson, that's fake. Our real name is Yakubashvili, was arrested in the middle of Kiddush Friday night, sentenced to death. Sentence was commuted to 25 years in the Gulag. He was imprisoned and tortured and exiled. He made it out towards the end of the war. And the young family, on false papers and passports, made it out of the Soviet Union because Stalin allowed Polish citizens to leave after the war. So if you could prove with forged passports that you're a Polish citizen, you left. They left. They made it to the DP camps, the displaced persons camps in Poking in Germany, and then to Paris. And finally, at the end of 51, my young grandfather and mother and their 3 young sons came to Toronto. They made it to the West. But my grandfather fell ill, and he died shortly after in 1953. He was 53 years old. And 1 year later, his wife, my grandmother, died at the age of 44. And my father tells me, I was a yeshiva boy, I was in the dormitory. But my little baby brother, Shalom, who just died 3 weeks ago, was a little kid, 6 or 7 years old. No tati, no mami, there were no grandparents, there were no uncles, there were no aunts. When such a tragedy happens, a boy loses both parents, there's an uncle, there's an aunt, there's epis, a grandmother, a grandfather, a close friend, a neighbor, a cousin. He said, we had nothing. Grandparents were either dead or back in the Soviet Union. Uncles and aunts were non-existent. So I'm a yeshiva bachiro, and I have a little boy on my hands. What am I supposed to do with him? take him into the dormitory with me. You know what yeshiva dormitories look like? We can ask the yeshiva boys. They're wonderful places, but not for a 6-year-old kid. You need somebody to bathe him and feed him and put him to bed and nurture him and take care of him. My father was lost. And he shared with me that a Jew came over to him. This is 1954. And he said, I love what that little kid looks like. My wife and I are religious people. We never had children. We're very affluent. I'm going to give you $150,000 in cash, which in 1954 was perhaps a few $1,000,000. So you'll have it. And let me adopt your brother as my child. My father told me, he said, YY, it's a great idea. $150,000 in 1954, refugees, we had nothing. I'll be able to marry off me and my brother, put ourselves, establish ourselves in life without any family. And my younger brother will have a nice home to grow up in, an affluent, nice Jewish home. It seemed like the best possible solution under these tragic circumstances. My late father decided to consult, who was then the young Lubavitcher Rebbe, about the situation. And the Rebbe tells him in Yiddish, "Me verkauf nicht a Bruder." You don't sell your brother. I'm not trying to sell my brother. I'm trying to give my brother a future and myself and my other brother a future. The Rebbe said, he's going to adopt him, change his name. There's no relationship anymore. The family is broken. For all practical purposes, he's not your brother. And you don't know if they're going to allow visitations, and when they're going to allow visitations, they may want to hide even the connection. It's a whole different world, adoption. So my father looks at the Rebbe and says, what should I do with this boy? So the Lubavitcher Rebbe says, let's find a Jewish family that has kids his age. You pay them a stipend to give him room and board in their home. They don't adopt him. He's your brother. You visit him whenever you can. You pay them for the food and for the shelter and for the board. And he grows up in a home with other children his age. This is 54. My father turns to the Rebbe and says, where am I going to find such a family? He says, well, look, we'll find. He says, how am I going to pay them? I'm in yeshiva. He says, we'll help you get a job. Gets him his first job for $17 a week. 54, $17 a week. Now they need a family. So there was a Jewish family that also refugees. They became farmers in New Jersey in desperation. You know when Jews become farmers? Yeah. First day the cow kicked the farmer in his 2 teeth, got rid of his 2 front teeth. That was the Shalom Aleichem to the world of farming. Hightstown, New Jersey. You know Hightstown, New Jersey? Check it out. They didn't make it as farmers, so they moved to Brooklyn. They had 9 children without a penny to their name. My father goes to meet the couple who have 9 kids. And the man is like, we're trying to feed 9 children. The woman, you know the power of the Jewish woman, she's like, what's the question? Der Eberste speist 9 Kinder, wird speisen a Zenten. God feeds 9 kids, he'll find the food for the 10th. Of course we're taking him in, he's an orphan. And this family of 9 overnight grows into a family of 10. Extremely poor family. My father got a job through the Lubavitcher Rebbe's arrangement, making $17 a week. Don't get too impressed. Pays this money to this family raising his little baby brother. Continues his studies in yeshiva and goes to visit once a week, twice a week, as often as possible. And his brother at least has a home. There's brothers, there's sisters, there's action, there are playmates, there's food, there's a breakfast, there's a dinner, there's clothes, there's a bathtub, there's a bed, there's a teddy bear, there's a doll, whatever there is. No, my father goes to visit. This is his brother, his baby brother. This family of 9, of course, has younger siblings and has older siblings. They also have an older sister who's 19 years old. And of course, even though it's not official, but you know, this older yeshiva boy comes to the house and he notices that when he comes by the dining room table, there's a 19-year-old girl sitting. Now, according to the constitution of that community, The yeshiva boys were not supposed to talk to the Beis Yaakov girls. She's a Beis Yaakov student. He's a yeshiva boy. But nobody ever told them that they're not allowed to glance at each other. That memo they never got. And even if they got it, I don't know if they executed it. So the glances were shared week after week after week, but of course, all unofficially. One day, this woman once shared with me, the man didn't show up. My father never showed up. So she suddenly finds herself wondering where he is. This was the first time she could admit to herself, not so easy, that there are emotions. So she turns to her mother, very holy woman, and is like, why didn't he show up to see his brother? Of course, her mother got very irritated. Why is it your business to know why he didn't show up? She said, I'm just wondering why he didn't show up. Maybe he's sick. Maybe we should call him. Maybe I should deliver some hot soup. Maybe the mother's like, oy vey vey, this is none of your business. He comes to see your brother. Yeah, but it's good to know. Sooner or later, providence dictated the way things should go. And this young man and young woman got engaged, and I know the story because she's my mother. The name of their family is Lipsker. They had 9 children. They came from a farm. So my mother's parents, my maternal grandparents, took in my paternal uncle and raised him. So now my mother was both his brother-in-law and also his brother, so to speak. And my father was not just a brother, but also, so to speak, a brother-in-law. And I couldn't understand because I was growing up, all the parties of my grandmother, my mother's mother, Shalom Jacobson, my paternal uncle, would always attend, and I didn't understand this hybrid of families, like what's going on. Until I heard the story of where he was raised. And as I was standing and saying goodbye to my uncle, I thought about this. And I thought, who understands the mystery of a life? Here my father could have easily and naturally given him up to another family, which many would have advised would be the right and noble thing to do. But the vision of one man who said, don't separate from your brother. Stick it out with your brother. And he didn't know that by doing that, he found his own shidduch. He found his own soulmate, my mother, in that family where his brother was being raised. And when I was watching the family that he created, my cousins and their children, and to see dozens and dozens of descendants, when you looked at that moment, it was such a tragedy, and what a genuine tragedy. Sadly, not the only tragedy, but a tragedy. And a tragedy with seemingly a very bleak future. Like, what can come out of this? And then when I saw that sad day when we had to say goodbye, but I saw the legacy he created, the spirit, the beautiful family, and I understood, I don't know what would have happened if he would have been in the other house. Certainly he wouldn't have been connected to our family. Nobody ever understands the full story of a life, the mystery of a life, the meaning of a soul's journey, the power of a journey. This is part of the infinite plan and scheme, the grand plan of the Ribono Shel Olam, of the Master of the world. When a soul comes down, when a soul leaves, Mazel Tov. Why a soul comes down, where a soul comes down. Why do certain souls come into the world easily? And why do certain souls not come into the world easily? And if not for the great work of Rabbi Marty and the whole holy chevra who work day in and day out to make sure those souls are born, the most powerful and special resource of the Jewish people, our children, our future, our destiny. Who knows what would happen with those souls? And yet they're born, 19,000 of them, and become an infinite lasting light for the world and for the Jewish people. I conclude with this reflection, my friends, with this reflection and story. If you had to choose the Torah reading for Rosh Hashanah, what would it be? Anniversary of creation. Which parsha should we read Rosh Hashanah? Anybody? Bereshis, creation. Creation of Adam and Eve, right? That's what I would choose. Hanukkah, we read about the dedication of the Mishkan. Pesach, we read the portions about Pesach, the story of the Exodus. Shavuos, we read Yisro. So why don't we read Rosh Hashanah, Bereshus? Get the kasha, Rabbi Katz, no? You know what we read about Rosh Hashanah? We read about Sarah being promised a child and giving birth to Yitzchak. We read about Hagar being promised a child, giving birth to Yishmael, and then Yishmael being saved from thirst. We read about Avram Avinu getting back his child after the Akedah. We read about his brother Nachor having children. And then in the Haftarah, what do we read about? Chana having a child, Shmuel, Rachel weeping for her children. Excusez-moi? Rosh Hashanah is Children's Day? I thought Rosh Hashanah was the anniversary of creation. Rosh Hashanah, read about the cosmos. Teach me about the black holes. Teach me about the atomic structures. Teach me quantum physics. Tell me about Schrodinger's cat or particles or waves. Tell me about light frequencies and velocity. Tell me about the structure of the genome and the 80 trillion cells in the human body. Teach me about photosynthesis. I mean, the world universe is grand and infinite. But what our sages understood is, you know how Jews celebrate the creation of the cosmos? You know how we celebrate the creation of Adam and Eve? You know how we celebrate it? Through focusing on children. For us, the greatest celebration of life and of the universe is by being attuned to our children. Every child. That becomes the focus of Rosh Hashanah. Just one life. So till they built the World Trade Center, before, the tallest building in the Western Hemisphere was Sears Towers in Chicago. It had that record from 1973. When the World Trade Center was unfortunately destroyed 20 years ago, obviously it became the tallest building again until they rebuilt the Museum of the World Trade Center in 2014. But if you go to Chicago and you'll ask to visit Sears Towers, attracting millions or million visitors a year, tourists a year, because of its height, they'll tell you that the name was changed. Today it has two names. People call it Sears because that's the old name. But the classic legal name is Willis Towers. So my son was learning in a yeshiva in Chicago. I was thinking about the stories. I asked him, how do you guys, people in Chicago, how do they call these towers? He says they call them Sears and they call them Willis. Who came to visit? So the CEO of Willis Holdings Groups, Joseph Plumeri, shared the story a few years ago at a graduation event for students. And he said, I want to tell you how the name change came to be. I wanted to move into the building. But I only needed 2% of it. 20% of it was vacant at the time. Sears and its 14,000 employees were gone from 1993. So I went to the owner and I said, I need to rent out 2% of your building. He said, great. Prepared a contract, a date, lawyers, negotiations. Before I signed, Joe says, I share with the owner, I said, I have one request. You know, Sears is an old name, what you would call an alten nomen. It's an old name. It represents decay. We need a new name that would present youthfulness and freshness and vibrancy, not the past, the future. So the owner says, what name would you like? She says, let's call it Willis Towers. Of course, he's the CEO of Willis Group Holdings. And the man said, fine. And Joe Plumeri, the CEO, is telling this to the students that all my friends told me I was crazy. I was insane. It will never happen. But he did it. He agreed. I moved in. And the name changed. Willis Towers. He looks at the students and he says, one evening, I was interviewed on the evening news by Brian Williams. And he looks at me and he says, Mr. Plumeri, how in the world did you manage to get the owner to change the name from Sears Tower to Willis Tower? And he said, I looked straight into the camera and I said 2 words. How? I asked. I asked. Achas sha'alti. We are afraid to ask. We're afraid to really ask. Who wants disappointment? I've had too many disappointments. Too many backstabs. Too much frustration. Too much ridicule. Too much cynicism. I already gave up on my own real power and happiness. You don't ask. Problem is, when you don't ask, the answer is always no. David was a melech. Under any circumstance, achas sha'alti. He didn't stop dreaming. He didn't stop asking. And when you ask, things happen. If nature has to change, it changes. If you need a miracle, miracles happen. But you have to ask. Achas sha'alti. You have to be able to ask. So tonight, Rabbi Marty and all of his people are asking. They're asking to partner with them to be able to allow all the future mothers of our people, all the future mothers of Moshe Rabbeinu's, or students and children of Moshe Rabbeinu's, to be able to light up our world with their eternal glow. Thank you very much.
This class is brought to you by theyeshiva.net. Please help us continue the classes. Make even a small contribution at www.theyeshiva.net/donate.